Welcome to Philosophy Slam, the podcast with myself, Mark Vernon, and
Robert Rowland Smith. Hello, Mark.
Hi there, Robert. We get together in person as well as online and play with words. In the in-person version of the Philosophy Slam, people call out words from the audience and we see where the evening goes on that basis. But Philosophy Slam, the podcast, still a relatively new undertaking, is a chance for us to do a more extended version of what does happen during the slam in person, where we connect words and see where that takes us, whether there's resonance, whether there's a way in which words together unfold the improvisational nature even more so. And Robert, we sometimes we think about words that have come up in the slams in person, but we also have resorted to random word generators in the internet age, widely available. And you have consulted with that digital oracle and come up with two words for us to think about now.
I have. And funnily enough, the first word that came up is a word that we have been given in the slam, and the word is adult. The second word, however, I think was a complete left field choice, and the word is soak, S-O-A-K, soak as in soak in liquid, essentially. So I'm going to kick us off and try and wrench these two words together or squeeze some sort of meaning out of them. And it strikes me there is a connection between the two. And Mark, because you're an expert on William Blake, I think you'll find this particularly interesting because I think there's a connection to do with innocence and experience, which we'll come to. So when we soak something, we make it pure again by cleansing it often. So particularly if you do the laundry, you will soak something overnight to get rid of a stain. I mean, you might soak other things. You might soak chickpeas in water overnight, for example, so that they hydrate before you turn them into hummus. But soaking, in most cases, is the process of absorbing water. If you go for a soak in the bath, you absorb water, and we associate water with cleanliness. So that's one side of the equation, at least as the first way into it. The other side of the equation is the word adult. Now, there is a very obvious way in which the cleanliness of soaking is opposed to adult, because when we think of the word adult as in pornography, we've got something dirty. So we've got the clean and the dirty there. But I don't want to necessarily go that far down the opposition between the two words. And come back a little bit, but because there is a sense in which becoming adult is losing some of our cleanliness, the cleanliness we associate with newborn babies, for example, the lovely baby smell people go on about, and that we acquire over time scars, emotional or physical, experience, good and bad, memories, joyful and sorrowful, and so on. And therefore that the process of growing up, of becoming adult, or to use the technical term, adolescence, becoming adult, is really one of, in a sense, the opposite of becoming quote unquote clean. It's acquiring depth and colour, and sometimes, not in a particularly good way, sometimes in a kind of beautiful way, obviously. But whatever being adult is, it is a process. It is a process, and it's a process that occurs in time, and is one of, when you buy a new product or a new car or something, changes over time. The car doesn't stay, it doesn't have that nice showroom smell about it, 10 years, 20 years later. So I think that, we can set them up a little bit in contrast to one another to get into the subject matter. And then I'm sure we'll go elsewhere, Mark.
Well, I'm glad you did that because I'm a psychotherapist. And so a word like adult, at least intuitively, feels like I should be comfortable with that. There's plenty one could say about that when slamming. The word soak, I was a bit scared of, actually. I was thinking, I don't even know what the etymology is of it. How am I going to find a way into this word? It feels like pretty sui generis, somehow onomatopoeic kind of word, I guess. It sounds a bit like what it describes. And now that you said that, though, it made me think about the great call of Freud, and it's one of the bits of Freud that really still resonates powerfully in modern psychotherapy, which is that becoming an adult is an achievement. the idea that becoming an adult is an achievement. And perhaps the word soak can help us to understand why it's thought of as an achievement, not just something that spontaneously happens given enough time. And I think it must be because we have to move from Aboriginal infant soaking in parental love to an adult relationship towards love. And that is quite an undertaking, because as a youth, as an infant, even in utero, where you're literally soaked in the mother's presence, love there is sort of given to you in order to support your development. And it moves in stages, though, because there's got to be, I think, steps where the love is present, but then the love is felt to be limited. But if that sense of limit can be survived, then it opens up another dimension of love. Let me put it a bit more tangibly. The idea is that when you're still soaked in the mother's love, say in utero, there's very little sense of differentiation between you and the parent. There's this kind of warm embrace, soaking in presence. And that, though, faces ruptures. I mean, maybe it's even the rupture of birth itself, but certainly in very young infant life, where the child starts to realize that when it's hungry, it doesn't automatically get fed. When it's cold, it doesn't automatically receive warmth. When it feels uncomfortable, it doesn't automatically receive consolation. I.e., the parent's love, with the best will in the world, is going to let the young child down. And that creates a first kind of rupture where you realize that, gosh, reality does not just respond to my desire and will and even command. And so you get this phenomenon, not just of the very young baby smell that you mentioned there, but also of the child that refuses to be comforted. Why won't they take the bottle? The parent will say, well, maybe it's partly because there's a kind of rage at the realization that this bottle breast requires someone else's collaboration and cooperation. And so that's a sort of rupture of the Aboriginal love. But of course, if you can survive that rupture, then you realize that love is much more fascinating. It's not just a soaking, but it's actually about relating to another person, and that expands love. And it also calls forth something from you. You've got to be a bit more of your own person in order to do that relating. And so the idea, I think, is that in this developmental model of what happens in becoming an adult, you go through these sort of waves of satisfaction and dissatisfaction, of trust and then trouble, with love. But if you can make it through these various steps and stages, then you become an adult. And the adult would be the person who can love not because they depend upon an Aboriginal soaking, but because they can give love as much as receive it, and so can be a participant with all that they are in this adult transformation of the early soaking.
I like that. And I want to add a kind of footnote to what you said, because my mind had gone somewhere a little bit similar to where it went for you. And then go on to the notion of getting soaked by rain and the connection with being an adult there. So the variation on what you said is absolutely, we, funnily enough, begin lives in this amniotic fluid. We are kind of soaked. We're actually in a liquid environment before we're in what do you call it, a dry, open air environment, I suppose. And one of the functions of that uterine environment is presumably it does make us feel protected. It made me think also of Achilles, who's dipped in the river, which protects him and gives him almost infinite strength, except for the fact that his heel isn't dipped in, because that's where he's held when he's dipped in. And so hence the Achilles heel, the point of vulnerability, which I think in relation to what you're saying is a good metaphor for adulthood. It's like we are, through this process you're describing of becoming adult, capable of building up our defenses and resources, not to the point necessarily of being defensive, but having things that can protect us from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, but only up to a point. There's always going to be something in us, an Achilles heel, psychological or otherwise, where we will be a bit vulnerable, and you'll be familiar with people being triggered by things, which is their psychological Achilles heel. But in principle, the idea is becoming an adult is one where we are now capable of acquiring our own defenses. So we don't need to be in the womb anymore, or we don't need the parents to protect us anymore. We can strategize around what we're going to need in the world going forward. The connection with getting soaked in the rain is a tenuous one, obviously, but this is philosophy slam. It's that sometimes we go out without an umbrella, even though we're adults. We have all the equipment, particularly these days, to know when it might rain, and yet sometimes we chance it, or sometimes we're caught out, and most of us possess an umbrella, and most of us possess the wherewithal to know when it might rain or not. And yet, from time to time, still, I do occasionally, not often, once a year, maybe twice a year, I will still get soaked when I go out and get rained upon. And that's connected to our theme, because I think becoming adult is not only acquiring a bank of experience, but acquiring a bank of experience from which one can then predict the future. I've seen the weather like this before. I know it, despite what the weather forecast says, I'm going to take an umbrella because we're in England and it's likely to rain. So the capacity to predict, I think, is something which separates the adult from the child. I know it's not a hard and fast distinction. And therefore, our capacity to be surprised or shocked ought to be less as we grow up than it might be. Because in a certain sense, when we're children, everything is a surprise. I've got 3 children all grown up now, but I remember, all 3 of them when they were 3 or 4, just being amazed when suddenly, what do you mean it's bedtime? Because they have no sense of time for a start, but also no capacity really to predict what's going to happen next. It's like, oh, now we're having lunch. It's like, wow, amazing. I hadn't expected that to be happening, even though it's happening at exactly the same time today as it did yesterday. So I think building on what you say about the process of becoming adult and the skill, whether actually predictability, the capacity to predict is part of that, because we have theories of the world and how the world is going to operate. And therefore that being soaked either by the rain or by metaphorical drenchings where unpleasant things happen to us ought to increase over time.
You're making me think about another kind of saturation that is much discussed these days, which is the way that our lives are saturated by technology, and in particular social media. And whilst this is often talked about in hedonistic ways, as if social media gives us endless dopamine hits, whatever particular hormone is your reference of choice, I think there's something else going on here which links actually saturation, soaking in technology with a loss of adulthood. It's kind of infantilizing. And the way you might think about this is that I think social media, it promises 2 things which as an adult you have to learn to manage. And one is control, or the lack of control in life. And one is community, or the responsibilities of building relationships. Responsibilities in the sense of paying attention to others, not just paying attention to yourself. And what you get with social media is the promise of a kind of community that, though, is just premised on paying attention to yourself. What do you like? What do you not like? And a kind of control that is about being able to flick on and on and on and on until you find the next thing. And then the minute that dissatisfies you, flick on and on and on as well. So this is a kind of infantilizing of our adult need to navigate what we're in control of, what we're not in control of, what makes us belong in community, and what we have to give in order to belong. And I think that that's part of the sort of deeper fear, really, of social media, that it's infantilizing us. It's not just that it's inflating the hedonistic part of the modern world, the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, for very good reason, that one wants to do that. But there's something sort of deeper that might be undoing our capacity to be adults in social media. And I think you perhaps, how might you test that theory, you might say? And I wonder whether the fragmentation that people feel social media amplifies is key here. So the fragmentation is not just me in my world with my screen in front of me, but because it has this infantilizing effect, the young child is the one who can't tolerate nuance, who can't deal with greys, who can't link seeming opposites together. So the young child, if you have one, you'll know that they're very clear. They either like something or they don't like something. They want to be here or they don't want to be here. They're happy or they're upset. It's a world of blacks and whites. And part of the business of becoming an adult is to move more and more into the worlds of greys and nuance and find contentment and satisfaction there. And so I feel like it's not just the mechanics of social media that's taking us into our private domains, but it's the psychology of it too that's, potentially making us less and less capable of dealing with things in an adult way.
Mm. I want to build on that, actually, because the other connection for me from what you said between social media and soaking and adulthood is that I think, this has only just occurred to me, social media is an experience of infinity for us, because we know when we go on Instagram or whatever our social media platform of choice is, that there's no end to the scrolling. We could continue infinitely. It would never end. That there's no point at which we would run out if we carried on scrolling, because there's stuff constantly being uploaded. And I think it is an experience we have these days of the infinite. Now, there are a couple of ways of understanding that. One is, if it's a feeling of the infinite, it's also one of abundance, which means that it does take us back to a infantile state of being provided for endlessly. Like, we don't like this, there'll be more. Mom, I don't like the cabbage, now I can have some ice cream, and just keep requesting and keep being served things up without limit. Instagram never says, stop, you've had enough, for example. As I don't know this, but I think some gambling apps, now have limits put on and probably tell you, sorry, you've got to stop there. But as far as I know, in most social media, you can just carry on infinitely. And I think that does create this sense of infantile, non-adult, pre-adult sense of, I'm a child, I can continue to ask, and there will always be material resources served up to me. And at the same time, I think we have a version of, and you talked about psychology, a version of what Lacan talks about in terms of desire. So, I associate Lacan with this thought, but it's probably not original to him. The idea being that desire is this appetitive state where you get served something and you're both wanting and having at the same time. So you have the feed from social media and it satisfies something to the precise extent that it stimulates the desire for something else at the same time. I think Lacan equates this with sexual activity too. Like, while you're having sex, you're both having it and wanting at the same time. And I think eating is a sort of similar thing, but they reach a sort of limit. And for Lacan, implicitly, I may have misremembered, but this is the source of anxiety too, because it's the having and the wanting without conclusion that's the issue, and that is actually depleting over time. And so this sense of infinity for us then, when we are on social media, is the anxiety around not having a limit, not having a boundary, not having a frame, which is in fact one of the things parents do put in place, because they say after a certain point, well, I'm sorry, there's no more ice cream. It is 9 o'clock, it is time to go to bed. There are boundaries as well as abundance.
And that reminds me of maybe different kinds of infinity. So I think there is the kind of infinity of quantity, which just goes on and on and on and on. But a writer in a more spiritual guise would refer to an infinity of quality. And that's when a limited thing can provide you with infinite depth, for example. So you might know a piece of music really very, very well, to the point that you are able to detect when different performances of the music vary even from note to note. And yet it's that depth of awareness that enables you to enjoy it, the infinity of that limited thing, because it's a qualitative experience rather than, and I guess that's a sort of adult appreciation, that takes a certain kind of effort on your part to get to know the music, to invest in it, a kind of musical awareness. Whereas, the qualitative approach gets usurped by pure quantity, as you're suggesting. So I think there's a lot in that. And again, these two words seem to be taking us into quite an interesting analysis of our times and its troubles. In fact, I hadn't thought that would occur.
No, very good, Mark. Thank you.
So we'll draw to a close. I hope that Adult and Soak has taken you in surprising directions as well. Do like what we're doing. If you do share it if you feel others might as well. Check out our website for our in-person performances as well. But you have been listening to Philosophy Slam, the podcast, with myself, Mark Vernon, and
Robert Rowland Smith. Thanks, Mark.
Cheers for now.